Thank you for joining us, Ms Lewis. I declare open this public hearing of the Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade, Defence Subcommittee, in relation to its inquiry into the Department of Defence Annual Report 2023-24. This hearing will be broadcast on the Parliament's website, and the proof and official transcripts of the proceedings will be published on the Committee's website. I now welcome the Australian Industry Group to give evidence today, and we will be joined, I think, with your colleague online as well. And a little later we will hear from the Lowy Institute as well. For the Hansard record, would you please state your names and the capacity in which you appear before the Defence Committee?
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm Kate Lewis, the Head of Defence and National Security at the Australian Industry Group.
And joining us by teleconference, Dr Wilson.
Yes, thank you, Chair. My name is Dr Jeffrey Wilson. I'm the Head of Research and Economics at the Australian Industry Group.
Thank you very much. The hearing is a legal proceeding of Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of the Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard, and it does attract parliamentary privilege. I now invite you to make an opening statement before we proceed to discussion.
Thank you very much, Chair. I will make a very brief opening remarks today. I'm appearing today on behalf of the Australian Industry Group Defence Council, the peak national body for Australia's defence industry. The Australian Industry Group Defence Council represents the interests of defence companies from small and medium enterprises through to global primes across the defence supply chain. Thank you very much for the opportunity to address you today on the inquiry into the Defence Annual Report 23-24. In this time of significant geostrategic uncertainty, we acknowledge the critical nature of the defence and industry partnership and the ongoing contribution of the defence industry to both national security and to economic outcomes. In that context, we commend the Government and the Department of Defence for the continued and resolute focus on national security and defence issues, including the AUKUS framework, and ongoing commitment to partnering with the Australian defence industry. There are a range of positive initiatives that our members have asked us to highlight, including the commitment to a biannual national defence strategy, updating the integrated investment program and the defence industry development strategy. The narrowing of the strategic defence industry priorities and the associated epochs presents an opportunity for a more focused approach. Members also highlight success stories across the growth of a range of small to medium enterprises through the ingenuity of those businesses, their world-class technologies and positive relationships. That said, significant structural challenges remain for the Australian defence industry, which is hindering the sector. First and foremost is a budget challenge. Despite increases in the defence budget overall, the rising pressures of inflation, workforce, estate, security, and the inclusion of the AUKUS Pillar 1 continue to impact the overall defence budget and acquisition and sustainment budgets. This budget situation, coupled with the requirement for ongoing improvements in decision-making and regulatory requirements, is impacting our industry and, in some ways, our ability to contribute to defence outcomes. In that context, the defence industry looks forward to engaging more fully on the updated National Defence Strategy Defence Industry Development Statement to inform those critical documents with our insights, together to develop the resilient industrial base we need in the current geostrategic circumstances. So thank you very much. Dr Wilson and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I might just commence with a couple of questions, colleagues, and then if you can indicate to the Secretary or to me directly that you have questions, I'll come around. The committee will be going to the north for public hearings. Can I ask a question about that particular region? You point to funding upgrading of Australian northern bases. How important are those bases to Australia's strategic goals, and what further improvements need to be made in your view?
Thank you very much for the question. Certainly the Defence Strategic Review and the following National Defence Strategy set out the importance of that region, set out the importance of upgrading the infrastructure and the capabilities in that region. I think our submission, if you refer to that, also has some important investments that are made. And so we would very much encourage those investments to be A, transparent, and B, ensuring that industry can engage. understand what is required, but very much acknowledge the importance of that part of the country. We actually took the Defence Council there a little while ago. We're incredibly impressed by the work that's going on, the infrastructure and the capabilities that are being built there.
So I'm glad that you're impressed. Can I get right into the guts of it and say I keep hearing this word transparency? So nobody's being transparent about what the transparency challenges are. So can I ask you to put on the record so that we understand what exactly do you mean? Where are the dark spots that you obviously have some concerns about?
So more broadly, I think if you go back a little bit of time in history, and I think this was part of the evidence that was given to one of the hearings previously, there was more information put on the public record for both the broader public, for industry and even for parliamentarians about what the industry and investment program looked like. Now, for lots of reasons, including some national security reasons, that information has been much more limited. So we saw that from about the 2020 period onwards. We now have an extremely broad, high-level integrated investment program that just sets out the programs for investment at an extremely high level. The issue for industry in that is it is far too late for industry to receive a tender and generate the in some cases getting permission to invest from global headquarters, workforce, supply chain, everything. It's too late. They need a long lead time to lead up to creating the investments.
Okay, and that's for primes as well as SMEs?
Both. So for the industrial base. Now, to the government's credit, they have said, well, we're going to do communication differently as a result of those changes. So the defence industry development sets out different communication strategies at different levels of security, at different levels of classification, I should say. So we have, and they are, I would say that process of developing that communication strategies are evolving. Right. So we have environmental working groups, we have some classified briefings, and I know the government, and particularly the Minister for Defence Industry, has been very focused on that. But from Defence's point of view, it's still a long way to go. And I think our submission particularly references some infrastructure investment, for example, where it was difficult to tell whether some of the announcements were previous ones, whether they were new announcements, and the level of fidelity required for investment. But is it okay if I pause and ask Dr. Wilson if he has anything to add?
Yeah, I've got more questions based on what you just said as well. So, Dr. Wilson, you want to add anything?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies, I had feedback on my line. Part of the issue here is we're going through a period of a rapid increase in Australia's defence spending. Over the last 5 years, acquisition spending has increased on an annual rate of 9.6%, sustainment of 7.3%.
Sorry to interrupt you. Dr. Wilson, I need to interrupt you and just ask you, do you have your handset to your ear or do you have it on speaker?
I have a headset in my ear. Yes.
We're getting a little bit of bounce around in terms of sound. You're coming and going a little. Perhaps just try without the earphones and see if we can get...
Let me try.
Otherwise we won't be able to hear it. We heard that.
Hello, I'm back again.
That is much clearer for us. Thanks, Dr. Wilson. So if you could recommence, that would be helpful. Thank you.
My apologies. The context for this is a sustained uplift in Australian defence spending, particularly looking over the last 5 years. We've seen a 9.6% annual growth in the acquisition spending and a 7.3% rate of annual growth in our sustainment spending. This is very often oriented towards supporting new capabilities, which are often in areas that will be new to Australian defence industry. One of the challenges that industry faces is having a clear pathway of what that's going to look like over the next 5 years, because procurement and sustainment that needs to be done in 2, 3 and 5 years really requires preparatory industry capabilities to be put in place now or very soon. The challenge is that from a perspective of industry, we can see headline budget numbers just to the acquisitions and sustainment and services levels. And as Kate mentioned, the integrated investment program of the IIP, which gives some indication of the broad categories into which that falls.
Okay.
But down to a business level, that's not sufficient level of information to say in any particular capability of area, well, what exactly is needed? What's that workforce going to look like? What's my plan to be ready for when that tender comes up on AusTender in 3 years' time? That means it's difficult for industry to get prepared for those things, and this is something that would apply across the industrial base, from primes right down to the SMEs that play a key role in their supply chains.
Okay, so if I can translate that into, I'm sitting at home and happen to turn on the channel and I hear this broadcast. In plain speak, we've got a national security challenge. It's a hotter environment that's been for a long time. Information that used to be free-flowing across the sector is now not flowing for a very, very good reason. The problem we have, though, is that information needs to flow in an effective, safe and secure way with sufficient lead time to generate the workforce, to make sure the facilities are ready, and to allow for one of the things that is the focus of our inquiry, integration in all possible ways. I haven't got a sense from you about confidence that that communication problem is resolved or is likely to be resolved in the near term. Am I right or am I wrong with my hearing of what you've just said?
I think you've summarised the issue perfectly, and I think that those communication strategies are still evolving and still growing.
I love those words, but what does that mean? I mean, has it got any better or has it got worse? Is it effective or is it not effective? What's the problem? What's the transparency problem?
The transparency problem, as we see it, is that our members say to us, we do not have the information that we used to have. We need to have it in order to make exactly those investment decisions that you referred to. I would say there is a spectrum. So some of the environmental working groups do a fantastic job and have been holding classified briefings. Some of them are less so. And some of them, it is just a lack of transparency. And I am using that word again, but it is still quite difficult for industry to know where to invest and how to invest, despite the classified briefings, which I know Defence is putting effort into and increasing. One of the reasons is, of course, the ability to hold a classified briefing for a very large number of people is limited by the spaces and so forth.
So it's a wicked problem, but we can't just keep waiting for transparency to sort of clear up. That we need to understand that this is going to be resolved, because everything is underpinned by this sort of communication challenge being met in a way that doesn't compromise national security, but actually maximises national capacity. So I just thank you for your answer, but I don't think I feel like it's heading in the right direction just yet. So I need indication from my colleagues of whoever's got a question. Thank you very much. I'll go to Claire first and then I'll come to Mr Boyce. Sorry.
Thank you.
Miss Claire Clutterham, not just Claire.
Just Claire is fine. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ms Lewis, for being here today. I just had three. I might ask the first two and see how we go. So you talk about the need for a well-defined sustainment model for Australia's nuclear-powered submarines. And you also talk about a need for the establishment of a commercially viable nuclear ecosystem. I just wondered, with respect to both of those, what are the timeframes by which you say these items are needed? With respect to the latter, what is a commercially viable? What do you mean by that? And then in both, what is the role for AIC, given this really is a first-of-kind endeavour in this country?
Thank you very much for the question. There's a number of different parts to that. I mean, first of all, I commend the Australian Submarine Agency for the work that they're doing on both of those issues and in constructing what is an extraordinary enterprise and including the industry uplift. I think part of the issue is, 2027 asking for timeframes is rapidly approaching, clearly. And in order to have that operational deployments here, which we welcome, and are very much working towards, One of the issues that members have raised with us is the importance of industry engagement to ensure that we are ready right across the board. And I know there's a lot of work being done on sustainment through ASC and so forth, and we respect and understand and commend that work. More broadly, it's about what that whole sustainment piece looks like from 2027 onwards. What does the model look like? What's the role of Australian industry? To get to the second part of your question, of course, because the magnitude and strategic importance of that program is so high, it will of course go across both commercial and military sectors in order to uplift, in order to start from 2027.
May I ask a follow-up, please? Thank you. And in terms of what it might look like, both the nuclear ecosystem and the sustainment model, what parameters do you see would be best placed to support Australian industry in participating in that?
So we did have some recommendations in our submission about the broader engagement of industry across a range of issues. We do feel that we have a lot of expertise in the broader industry base in terms of, looking at how the US and the UK sustainment models look, how Australia may be able to learn from that expertise. I know and I understand and I respect that there is a lot of work going on at the government-to-government levels, and understandably and appropriately. But this is that broader engagement piece about what the expectations on the broader industry is from 2027, and we would love to have additional conversations with ASA to support that.
Thank you. Mr Boyce, you have the call.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am trying to understand in practical terms where Australia sits in terms of its ability to manufacture and rearm itself, to supply itself, ADF personnel and so forth, from everything from uniforms and boots to handheld weapon systems to, the heavy-duty requirements that we need to have throughout our ADF to be an effective deterrent. So what capability does business and industry have to do that right now versus what do we need in the future?
I think that's a terrific question, and it goes to the heart of what we actually looked at in our report in defence industry in national defence, which I would commend to you. We released that with the ANU in December 2023. And I would say a couple of things. I don't have a very detailed answer because Defence is still kind of working on, the intelligence function, which was an action under the Defence Industry Development Strategy. So what we have been asking for as industry is, okay, let's work with that intelligence function. What does the capability look like now? And importantly, and an important part of, I think, what part of your question goes to is what do we look like now, but what does the industry base need and require in a time of conflict? And how would we not just have, an ability to slowly reconstitute, but actually reconstitute, respond, advance, expand with our commercial sector as well in a time of conflict? Part of the thing that, so to my mind, in order to answer your question more fully, we need that intelligence function, which I know Defence is working on. We need to understand what the base looks like now. We need to understand those vulnerabilities and work on, the supply chain security piece as well. In order to have those defined objectives in a conflict scenario, one of the things that has struck me in sort of preparing for this hearing too, there is a really strong sense of urgency in the Defence Strategic Review about our geostrategic situation, which has flowed through to the National Defence Strategy. A lot of our members don't see that same level of urgency and the same level of industrial focus to answer your very good question in the Defence Industry Development Strategy. So one of the things that I would commend to this committee and more broadly is flowing that sense of urgency now through what does the base look like, what does it need to look like in a conflict scenario as well.
So if I can just dumb that down a little bit. Are our boots and our uniforms made in China? Are our handheld weapon systems that our soldiers carry, are they imported from elsewhere in the world? Or do we have the capability of manufacturing that here in Australia right now?
I think there's a really broad range there. I think one of the things, and this is a really important part of the shift in the Defence Industry Development Strategy, which the government has made a very specific and in my mind quite a deliberate and intentional requirement, is the development of the sovereign industrial, defence industrial priorities, So that SDIPS is now the heart of our industry policy for defence. Anything outside that, if you look at the wording in the Defence Industry Strategy, it says we will look and maximise where we can effectively. In terms of, I know a lot of the clothing and so forth is made here, a lot of the, things that you mentioned are, but if you look at the heart of the industry policy, it's those SDIPs, which is why it's so important to get those right, why it's so important to have them informed by industry. But I might also refer to you, Jeff, because you also have supply chain security expertise.
Can we just get on the record, SDIPs? Lots of people who are listening don't know what they are.
Sovereign Defence Industry Priorities, SDIPs, and they are very important if you are listening because they set out the government's priorities in terms of what they want to do here in country. Thanks. Jeff?
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, everyone. I'll draw on some findings from, as the report Kate mentioned earlier, which was a previous study we'd done regarding defence industry as a capability in the defence sector. Some of these questions come to the issue of what's called in defence industry terms surge capacity. So in the time when the defence force is required to be deployed for whatever reason, how are you able to keep that going and keep them deployed in that setting? This often is something that may happen suddenly and under short time frames. One of the big challenges here, and this is a way to generally describe this problem across lots of different products that ranges from the very high tech through to the boots and shoelaces and uniforms and everything in between, is that the industry capability that is presently doing sustainment effectively becomes the capability that manages your surge in that period. And during a situation where this is called on, that's going to be put under significant strain very quickly. Some of us would have memories from the COVID pandemic of running out of hand sanitizer and face masks, similar kind of scenario, but placed in a defence industry context. In that situation, what this country has to then rely on is not defence industry, but things that are present are just civilian industry, adjacent and allied capabilities in manufacturing, science, construction, and all of those things, which would need to be quickly recruited to refresh and broaden that capability to meet that challenge. So in these scenarios, there's both a need to look at defence industry capability directly, i.e. that which is currently in our sustainment and acquisitions chain, but also that which is connected and adjacent to them, which in those situations would need to be brought to the fore. To that extent, your defence industry capability in those scenarios is not what you've got today, but what you can put together from civilian industry under relatively short order, as we had to do for some health products during the pandemic.
Okay, thank you very much. We have quite a number of questions, and I think we'll probably only have till about 6:40. So if we can move through them quite quickly, and if I can just remind witnesses, you have expertise. We are trying to talk to the whole nation as their representatives. So if you can pretend you're not talking to us, but talking, well, we are them. We're them. Just talk to us like people who are not in your world, right? Who want to understand what you're doing, because this is huge expenditure and it's of vital importance to the nation. So our job is to help that understanding. If I can go to Mr. Rebello for the next questions, and then Ms. Jarrett.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. In your, and thank you, Ms Lewis, for being here. In your submission, I just refer you to the part about the regulatory reform and procurement. Something that I'm really interested in, I had the opportunity to spend some time at HMAS Stirling recently, and procurement issues became sort of the flavour of the conversation. And what you've said here is that you've commended Defence's efforts to streamline procurement processes. I'm interested to know what those efforts have been, and also the results of those efforts, but also the further improvements that you would suggest take place.
Thank you very much for the question. Procurement policy goes to the heart of the relationship, and as part of the defence industry policy strategy, there was a very big focus on procurement reform under Mr Chris Deeble, the head of a Caperley Acquisition Sustainment Group. They have done a significant body of work, particularly looking at what's called ASDEFCON. ASDEFCON is the contracting templates that Defence use for the procurement of, particularly around major capital procurement. And they range, those templates range in complexity from relatively simple right up to major platforms. There's been a very significant line of effort from Mr Deeble to streamline those and to work with industry on what the procurements might look like. The strategy also talks to things like speed to capability, and there is an emphasis, given the strategic urgency and the geostrategic threats, to get, to ensure that we're balancing speed to capability and competition when we need to. I know there's a big line of effort around that. And also there's the introduction of the concepts of minimum viable capability, where, so essentially, in layman's terms, we're not tinkering with a bunch of, changes to make everything perfect. We're looking at much more in the range of an 80% solution. There has been criticism in the past where we were trying to perfect an Australian defence solution. So those are the kind of the big lines of effort that we think that Defence have done a good job on and continue to move. Nonetheless, members continue to report to us that evaluation times can still be extended, that not only is the template reform important, but also, of course, how you use it, which templates you use, and the skill set, which takes into account the risk judgments around those contracting and procurement arrangements. In terms of regulatory reform more broadly, we have seen a significant uptick in the regulation of defence industry, but more broadly as well, for a range of very good reasons. So there's been a whole range of new security regulations, very understandably and very importantly. But from our point of view, if you put that on top of the export control, regulatory reform, environmental reform, modern slavery, all these extremely good things that are often very, important regulatory reforms in and of themselves. When you look at them across the industry base, they are a significant impost on the industry. And something like cybersecurity is interesting because that policy, a significant amount of that policy is set by Home Affairs, for example. So we now have the Essential 8 Level 2, which is a high cybersecurity standard, understandably aimed at Commonwealth departments. That has flowed right through the Defence Industry Security Program, affecting all of the industry base in the defence sector. So it's those kind of things where you may have a good regulatory reform in isolation, but across the board, those procurement issues that I raised, plus the regulatory ones, make getting into defence supply chains, getting into the defence sector, a challenge for many of our members and the industry more broadly.
Could you take on notice if there are any assistance tools or any programs to help new entrants, small and medium enterprises in particular, but even primes, to more promptly acquire the skills or the documentation or the necessaries to implement that regulation? Because often the problem is everybody's making it up separately as they go. Is that what's happening, or is it? Yeah, right, which is hugely not productive. So if you could just take on notice anything that's happening that is coherent and cohesive and productivity oriented rather than just compliance oriented. That'd be great. Thanks very much. Great questions. Could I go to Ms. Jarrett now and then Mr. Newman?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ms Lewis. I just want to go back to the question the Chair raised about communications earlier, and I'm assuming that there is some current process for communications between the department and the industry, but if you're not getting the information you need to have the industry ready and to help build capability, and we're trying to protect national security, what's the answer? Like, well, do we need a change in process? Should consultation be different? Like, do you have a view on what needs to change to fix this?
I do think that I would probably think that actually I'd push back a little bit on the government and defence. I think there could be more put in the public domain, even regardless of the national security issues. And we can look at our, particularly our US counterparts as an example of that. So I think that's first and foremost what I would suggest. One of the issues, I think, is getting the industry in much earlier. I sort of implied this in my evidence previously, that having timing of communication is sometimes as important as the content. So having industry upfront, pre-gate zero, which means pre-kind of decisional for defence, where we're getting in upfront, being able to kind of, understand very early in a defence capability life cycle of what they want to buy, getting industry in and looking at what the defence capability is early on. That has always been significantly and forever and a day a challenge for defence because of probity issues, because of the concern about commercial complexities in doing that. We do think that that is a very, very important step though, so we would very much encourage earlier engagement and more significant engagement. And then I did mention before the fora which are developing, and they are. I would definitely keep that that functionality going and improving. They'd probably be my suggestions. Jeff, do you have anything else?
To elaborate on this, it's often said in defence industry that by the time a request for tender, a procurement document is issued, a lot of the decisions around procurement and Australian defence industry's participation have implicitly been made. So when the department says this is the capability we want and we design it, that already structures outcomes as to the extent and where and what Australian industry presently has, and could also potentially and realistically develop on the project timeline to be able to be part of that. This is the notion of like at stage zero, so to speak, that this question is we don't decide we want that and then, can Australian industry make it in the next 3 years, but we actually start asking these questions around capability acquisitions that take into consideration these issues around where Australia has current and incipient that could be able to meet that timeline as well. So with some stretch, those capabilities need to be put at the very start of the procurement process. By the time he's placed the tender on the market, the reality of the defence industry as it stands today may already have decided those things.
Okay, that raises heaps of questions. Could I just ask for you to give us an example of a similar stand-up of a critical procurement process, US versus Australia, and help us understand what the difference is with an eye to obviously concerns about national security. The other thing is, can I ask a question on notice as well? What knowledge does the Defence Department already have of capacity that's not completely and totally locked down to a particular product acquisition? Like, how sound is the Defence Department's knowledge of general capabilities where they might press to get a little bit more info in a more timely way based on what you've just been saying? Mr. Newman.
Now, Ms Lewis, thanks very much. I don't want to sound facetious, but you used a word which I never thought we'd use today in this public hearing. That was the word love. And love can be both a noun and a verb. You can be in love, or you could love, I love my wife. Now, the Australian Submarine Agency, its whole purpose was to safely and securely acquire, construct, deliver, technically govern, sustain and dispose of Australia's conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarine capacity. Okay? So conventionally armed nuclear-powered, acquire, monitor, construct, dispose of. Now, their purpose is to really love your industry, isn't it? I mean, they're to engage with you. It seems to be, do you need a dating agency or something like that, or an app? Because, your idea is to engage, their purpose is to engage with your industry. That's what their role is. If you look at, and they've been established since the 1st of July 2023. There's a bit of unrequited love there, isn't there? I mean, seriously, why aren't they engaging with you in a way that you would come to this committee and publicly say you would love them to engage with you more? What's wrong? What's going wrong?
Yes. I love the question.
Do you really?
Again, I just think that remit that you read out is just an extraordinary scope of a project and a program that Australia has never seen anything like it. And the Australian Submarine Agency has just got so many initiatives, and a lot of it has been at the government-to-government level, and they are pursuing enormous regulatory reform, legislative reform, everything that you would need to do a complex, optimal pathway across different nations. So I would give them that. We would very much commend to them a broader industry engagement, as you're suggesting, across the industry, and the industry strategy that they released in earlier this year does have some green shoots, I would say, around that industry engagement. Given that where we are with the program, given that 2027 is close, we would love to see broader engagement and an acceleration of that engagement.
So they're not a very good suitor, are they?
I would not frame it like that.
Thank you very much. I think next is Ms Phillips.
Oh, thank you. I've just got a question around AUKUS Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, and I know that I think we've heard evidence that there's more structure and processes around AUKUS Pillar 1. What can we do to help encourage industry, or what do we need to do to support AUKUS Pillar 2?
That is a great question. Thank you very much. At risk of repeating myself, the Australian Industry Group released a report in August 2025 detailing, and Dr Wilson and I were the lead authors on that. And it detailed, we did a very significant stakeholder engagement around AUKUS Pillar 2 from an industry perspective. I'll just very briefly, the findings were that it would be very helpful to the industry base to have a lot more clarity around AUKUS Pillar 2. There were a lot of different views about, is it a military-to-military program? Is it early stage innovation? Is it acquisition? And secondly, how can we get engaged? So we had 5 significant findings, which I would commend to you in that report. We can certainly share that with the committee. The first one was a strategy from the Australian government perspective, saying this is the program, these are our milestones, this is where we're heading, this is our key measurables under AUKUS Pillar 2, from a national perspective, of course. Other findings and recommendations included specific and dedicated funding lines, rather than just at the moment it is broadly in the integrated investment program somewhere is AUKUS Pillar 2, and kind of industry is expected to sort of go through that. So specific dedicated funding lines. The enabling environment, I will commend the government and the work that was done on the ITAR reforms and the export controls reforms, and the authorised user licence-free environment. But there are other enabling environment issues that are critical for the industry to be engaged, and those industry engagement pathways, making those very clear as well.
Thank you.
Anyone else seeking the call? Yes, thanks, Mr. Barrett.
Thank you. In relation to the integrated focus force side of things, there's a lot of commentary about proportion of GDP going further up to 3.5 or further into the future. Just your views and or Mr Wilson's views about current funding levels and whether you think it's enough to do this integrated funding force.
I will refer that one to Jeff, please.
Thank you very much. Look, there's a lot of national discussion about expressing defence spending as a share of GDP. That itself, and the committee may be aware, is also fraught with issues of what constitutes defence spending. You may be aware there's an international discussion about this at the moment where some countries include military pensions and others don't in measuring that. That kind of points to the challenge and the lack of traction that you get when you're using it as a percent of GDP number. That's a budget figure to what you can put in. But the real question is in terms of defining the capabilities that Australia needs under the strategic circumstances it faces, and then how can we get that? If you need something and it's a certain percent of GDP, you need it. Look, you see that exercise in, say, the Defence Strategic Review of a few years ago. AUKUS Pillars 1 and 2 are a response to those things as well. What we would see in terms of the defence budget over this period is there has been significant strain despite the uplift in the overall spending level. Some of this has come out of many of those new initiatives, and particularly things that fell out of the Defence Strategic Review, which included uplifts around military estate. Northern bases are one. I know that was mentioned earlier in this discussion, but there are others around the mix as well, and also significant digital and cyber security uplifts that have been needed. Those things are important. One wouldn't detract any attention, detract any validity away from those issues, but it has put significant, in the short run, pressures on the increase in the funding for acquisitions, and also, particularly for a defence industrial base perspective, the available funding for our sustainment industry, which has not been able to grow at the same rate while those things are being carried by the budget. To the extent that this needs to be done, that those discussions, a GDP target doesn't resolve those questions. Because it's a top-down approach, what resolves those questions is a bottom-up approach that says, okay, what proper planning regarding defence requirements, industry's ability to contribute to those, and building it out from the bottom up rather than we've got X number of percent of GDP, what do we do with it?
Could I just ask, in light of the return of the conversation to the north, there is a strategic move to orient to the north and away from sort of population basis to north-facing ready force and the sustainment that's necessary for that, the capability to operate in those sorts of environments. How much of defence industry is relocating or co-locating with that move to the north so that integration can be more fruitful and more timely?
I think it's a really great question. I think I'd probably, for the detail, take on notice, I think. Again, Northern Australia, including Townsville, we had a very successful visit with the council and took industry to Townsville. It was just extraordinary, the military capabilities and the growth in that part of the world as well. But in terms of the detail of your question, I prefer to take on notice.
Thank you very much. We've talked a little bit about budget, and there's an extraordinary amount of money being invested in defence now. You know, as an Australian, this is a historic moment. And can I say it's a little jarring to hear there's not enough money when the expenditure is very significant. How can we ensure that Australians are getting value for money with every cent that's invested in our defence force and the industries that support it, both inside the forces and outside?
I think the premise of your question is a really important one. How do we ensure that Defence is spending the money in the most effective way? Certainly, as Australian Industry Group, we try to support that relationship in every way that we can, making sure that we're informing those the settings as best we can that I've talked about today. Talked about how to make those procurements as streamlined as possible, trying to make sure that the procurement processes are as efficient as possible. And I take your point absolutely. It is a very significant amount of money. I guess I would say to that also, when you look at the size of AUKUS Pillar 1, when you look at the, what's happened in terms of workforce, what's happened in terms of just the cost of living that we all feel in our own households, imagine that in defence, what that's actually done, trying to meet this strategic threat. And we here, as I said in my opening remarks, our industry is very concerned about what's being done in terms of the acquisition and sustainment budgets now in order to pay for things in the future. But I might also, if it's okay, Dr. Wilson, do you have anything to add?
Yes, certainly. I'm about to present some numbers, and I'm happy to present these in a question or notice in written form for the committee. But if we use the period of the last period of forward estimates for those that budget for me, the last 4 years, what we have seen is some significant increases relative to what we expected the future spending path to be 4 years ago at the start of the current period of forward estimates. So, for example, Kate mentioned workforce issues there. The cost of workforce over the last 4 years has ended up, the actual spending on it was 6.1% or $3.5 billion higher than anticipated at the start of that budgetary process. This reflected a few factors: significant skills shortages and wages growth in civilian defence industry, and also pressures on hiring and staffing in the ADF as well that has often led to certain pay outcomes required to retain or attract people. But when budgeting is done, those kind of costs need to be found from somewhere else. And what we have seen over the last 4 years is a dynamic where additional costs that were unanticipated in workforce, particularly also in a digital uplift around digital and cyber security, and around that security estate piece that we've talked about, including but not limited to northern bases, has had to be accommodated at the cost of new acquisition spending and sustainment spending for armed services.
Could I ask about the balance between in-house capabilities and production within defence and the complementarity with industry? Is the balance right? Do we have sufficient in-house capacity in defence to pick up the things that there may be inadequate, timely response from industry?
I'm sorry, I'm just trying to understand the question a little better. Do you mean the skills inside defence on the procurement side and so forth?
Well, always, procurement's just one part of the program, but, there's the industry sitting out here. We've got a defence force with certain capabilities. What's the crossover like between industry capacity and industry knowledge and some capacity inside defence? I'm just trying to figure out, is that part of where the information blockage is happening?
I think so. So from my perspective, there's a couple of parts to that. First of all, there was the move away from contractors to public service, which has affected departments, including defence. We understand that as a government policy and respect that. I guess the pace and the ability to create those skilled public service roles has not always, I don't think it's always kept pace with what the government was hoping for in terms of that transfer, and potentially has left some gaps. So I think that's one thing. I think the professionalisation within Capability Acquisition Sustainment Group, and just to focus there for a moment, I know again Mr Deeble is working on that professionalisation, but I do think there is a way to go there. Okay. So I do think...
So that's sort of the procurement angle, right? Training people up so they know what to ask for. What about actual physical capacity for building and innovation? How reliant are we as a nation on businesses as opposed to inside defence capacity? And what's the integration of those two things?
So I think if you're just focusing on innovation, so the Defence Science Technology Group, has a large capability and capacity. The Advanced Strategic Capabilities Accelerator is also being stood up and so forth. But the whole ecosystem is strained for the workforce.
Yeah.
And I know ADF are growing in their recruitment side of things and doing a lot of retention, and that's an excellent and wonderful outcome for the nation. It does impact the industry, of course, because, there may have been members who would have gone into the industry. So
In what kind of jobs are we talking here?
Oh, well, many of our member companies, for example, have veterans, coming out of defence. So
Yeah,
it's kind of a whole
the flow
ecosystem.
back in, right? So have we got the skill set inside defence? I suppose, like being blunt, are many of them being seduced out of the Defence Force into the private sector?
Well, I think there's a couple of answers to that. First of all, it's excellent to have flows backwards and forwards, because in order to get the industry skill set, it's a very good thing for defence people to have industry experience, and they often will take it back. Mr Deeble is an excellent example of that. He was in the industry and has gone back into defence. In fact, the Defence Industry Development Statement had initiatives around industry secondments. So rather than seeing it as just a zero-sum game, actually building all three of those portions, professionalising, skilling, and certainly coming out of defence after 21 years, getting that industry perspective is absolutely invaluable to take back.
So the DIDs, I'm breaking my own rule and using but I want to make the point that earlier you gave evidence that the DIDs is really like a don't zone. Things are not happening. It's not a do zone, it's a don't zone, right? So we can't leave it in the past tense. Currently we're dealing with a breakdown in the DIDS model. It's not advancing in the way that we might have hoped.
I think my testimony was along the lines that there were some excellent initiatives. If I was going to make 2 recommendations to the committee about the DIDs specifically, First of all, there are a lot of great actions in there. Implement them, and some of them have been, but there are quite a few that are still outstanding. I would say, rather than completely changing course, actually implement some excellent actions that were set out in the DIDs. And the second one, from my perspective, is to take a bolder approach to industry policy, for the very good reason that Mr Boyce and his question implied about what we actually need in a time of conflict, and how we set the industry up to surge and so forth as needs be.
So if I could ask you to take on notice what a bold approach looks like, fill that out a little bit for us, and your analysis of the DIDS program, the things that you could give a big tick to, things that you think are not yet happening, and any solutions you have or timelines that we should be aware of that you think are necessary for the DIDS program to actually be properly implemented. Now, all these will come on notice. We're just about out of time, but could I ask you one final question? Integration of the forces, integration of the efforts, integration of everything to make us an effective force with literal capacity requires us not to just work with ourselves but to work with other nations. So can I ask you a question around the clarity of Australia's international defence cooperation? How clear-eyed is it? How do you see that operating? And what does the AI group have on further collaboration with like-minded nations near and far in terms of your work program?
Yeah, no, that's great, and I might ask Dr. Wilson to back things up. I think you can see some excellent examples with defence with Papua New Guinea recently, and the work that we're doing in the region in that context. The AUKUS arrangement has definitely brought the countries closer, even for ourselves at the Australian Industry Group. The AUKUS framework has meant we have strategic partnerships with our sister organisations in the US and the UK, bringing our members together. So there are some examples that I would commend to you. But Dr. Wilson, do you want to talk a bit more broadly about the Australian Industry Group?
Oh, well, I might just add to that, to specifically focus on defence industry here, which is what we're here to speak about. There is a need to be able to make those connections, not just at a government to government, but at an industry to industry level as well. A good working example of this is the AUKUS Pillar 2 initiative. This is the advanced capabilities part, and I'd refer to research findings we generated in our report that Kate's mentioned earlier that we can supply to the committee. One of the challenges that we've found with this program is there's been significant levels of effort to improve innovation in defence industry through the 3 partner countries. We've seen things like ASCA, the Australian Advanced Strategic Capabilities Accelerator in Australia, similar counterparts in the UK and the US as well. One thing that has been missing at that level is the inter-country coordination at the industry level. A lot of that inter-country coordination is done at a G to G or government to government level. Often it's done at a military to military level, sometimes even at that level within a classification structure that is militarised only, so to speak. Something that could be developed much more strongly in the AUKUS Pillar 2 program, but this would apply more broadly across Australian defence industry, is being able to make those inter-industry connections that can support the intergovernmental connections in these programs.
Thank you very much for joining us today, Ms Lewis and Dr Wilson. There obviously have been a number of questions put on notice, and there might be a couple more that we didn't get to in the time that we have today with you. Can I thank you very much for giving us those insights? If you have been asked to provide this, could you do that by Friday the 14th of November? You'll also receive a transcript of your evidence and have an opportunity to request any corrections to transcription errors. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks, Ms Lewis. Thanks, Dr Wilson. Okay.
Next witness is here.
And I invite our next witness to come and join us. Thanks very much. I've got to read that again. Great. Thank you very much. I now welcome the representative of the Lowy Institute to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the Defence Committee?
Jennifer Parker, I'm appearing as a non-resident fellow with the Lowy Institute.
Thank you very much. This hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I now invite you, Ms Parker, to make an opening statement before we proceed to discussion.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all here today on what is a pretty important topic. My understanding is I'll offer a couple of remarks and then we'll hand to questions, and happy to take any questions you'd like. I guess, as I highlighted, I am appearing on behalf of the Lowy Institute, but I must flag that anything I say is my own personal opinion and doesn't represent the Lowy Institute or any of my other affiliations. Look, when it comes to the issue of Australia right now, the question is, can we effectively defend Australia and our national interests in our current strategic circumstances? And we can get into debates about integrated and focused force and things like that, which I would honestly say are very much buzzwords. The question is, do we have the capabilities to resource our strategy, and is our strategy the correct strategy? I would say that in the broad, the current government has done a lot of great work in terms of clearing up our strategy. It does build a course on the strength of the previous government and the 2020 Defence Strategic Update, which was the first real public message to the Australian community that the world was changing. Where we've lagged behind, though, is in our resourcing of our defence budget, and we can argue about 3 or 3.5% of GDP, or is GDP useful, and all of those elements. The fact is that we don't have the capabilities within defence to resource our current state of strategy. We have come a long way, and that should be acknowledged. I think that the decisions around AUKUS, the decisions around the future fleet, the decisions around Army amphibious capability, Army maritime strike, the list goes on, are important and effective decisions. But if I said to the average Australian, hey, look at what's happening between Russia and Ukraine or Israel and Iran in the 12-day war, look at those missiles flying, could we effectively defend Australia's critical infrastructure? Any of it against those missiles, the answer would be largely no. And I think that's one of the things that we need to grapple with. Of course, it isn't easy to talk about more money for defence that needs to be sold to the Australian public, and we need to have the conversation about where does that come from, and that is most certainly not an easy conversation. But I would leave those as kind of my opening remarks. Will give you a flavour of my thinking, and happy to take questions on anything.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your plain speaking. We are undertaking a review of the Defence Annual Report 23-24. And one of the key areas that we've been unable to get evidence on is one of those words you refer to as a buzzword, which is integrated force. And, you know, there are people here on the committee who've served. I haven't. And I'm asking this genuinely as just an Australian citizen who's here in the Parliament for the period of time that I am. What on earth does an integrated force really look like? You've given, accolades to our progress forward. How critical to the defence of a nation is an integrated force? Are we on our way? What needs to happen to make that work?
Look, I think the term integrated can mean many different things. If you're talking about a system, of course, you're talking about the integration of different sensors and effectors, so radars or missile systems into a system. If you're talking about a defence force, I think the term integrated for Australia is unhelpful. Normally, in my view, from my research and my experience, integrated is where you talk about the ability of a defence force and a Department of Defence to work with other government agencies. So if you're talking about national defence more broadly than the Department of Defence, or you're talking about national security, that becomes important in terms of integration, your ability to work together. What it means in the Australian context, I would say is not entirely clear. The Defence Strategic Review used it extensively. First real Australian strategic document to do so, although I note that the previous Chief of Navy, Ray Griggs, actually gave a speech in 2017 where he talked about the need to move towards an integrated force. What I take away from a term that is not defined in these documents is that there is an unhappiness with joint not being good enough, that with the services and the 5 domains need to be able to work more effectively together over a range of scenarios, and I think that is a fair statement. Where it becomes dangerous is where the term integrated removes certain degrees of autonomy or decision-making of the services. And so when I think about integrated force, it will never be one force because the different services and domains operate in different areas with different challenges. And those unique challenges require unique experience. So in terms of what does integrated mean in the ADF, I think it is a more centralised structure within the ADF, and we've increasingly seen that. If we want to talk about centralisation of the ADF, we can go back to the 70s Tang Review, the removal of a Minister for the Navy, for the Air Force, etc. All of those which were broadly good. How is it reflected in today's ADF? I think the key example of integration in today's ADF is the establishment of a Chief PERS organisation. So that is a 3-star organisation, which was a recommendation from the Defence Strategic Review.
Okay, so I don't understand what you just said.
Sure.
So can you go back to the Defence HERS and I can pick it up from there?
Sorry, Defence Personnel Organisation.
Oh, okay.
So the Defence Strategic Review, when it flagged the need to integrate, it wasn't talking about integration just across operations, which is important. It was talking about integration across the Australian Defence Force, which in its enactment, one of the key decisions around that, in my personal view, was the establishment of a Chief PERS, so a 3-star responsible for the personnel management of the Australian Defence Force. That has integrated aspects of career management and people processes. In some ways, I think that that is positive. When we come down to Defence's workforce issue, my personal view is that Defence has a capacity issue. Workforce is one lever of capacity, as is structure, as is processes, as is the capability you acquire. The idea of increasing commonality of processes across the personnel organisation between the three services is a great idea. Where I think it goes too far in terms of centralisation and integration is when the chiefs of services have little influence over their people. That's focusing in on one element of integration. The reason it is hard to understand is because the term isn't defined and it's not, in my view, commonly used by other Defence Force equivalents to explain what we mean it to be, which is something internal to the department as opposed to the department's ability to work with other departments.
So the term joint, and which was what we used to talk about, and you articulating that there's a position where you think perhaps it's not good enough. If I can just reflect on a little bit of reading that I've done, my understanding is instead of meeting separately, we've got maritime, land, airspace, cyber now actually getting together to make the decisions. That is a structural dimension of this integration, and that is a change for us.
I personally would not view that as a change. So the Joint Headquarters was established in the early 2000s. Of course, it went through its ups and downs in terms of the ability to operate together, and increasingly as we've developed capabilities in the space and cyber domain, they have been a complex thing to think into multi-domain operations, that is, ability to conduct operations across the 5 different domains. Yeah. I'm not aware of the internal structure of the Joint Headquarters. It's not available in the public domain. But what I would say is prior to the Defence Strategic Review, I don't think it's accurate to say that in operational planning, the other domains weren't factored in. So I'm not sure that there have been structural operational changes, bar changing of terminology around this integrated element. There have been structural management changes, and the example I gave was the Chief PERS organisation.
Yeah. I understand what you're saying now, thanks.
But where I think it is a challenge though is, and again, we're talking in the broad, and you can give lots of specific examples where it may be a good thing or a bad thing. But one of the key lessons I would say from Ukraine and the ability to fight a war is that increased centralisation of management and command and control is a problem, because the more centralised your organisation is, the more you require a command and control backbone, the more you eat up decision-making capacity. And so I think that decentralisation of some elements of defence, re-empowering the services and the chiefs of services and other elements of defence could be important. So I think it's about finding the balance between centralisation, which is what I'm taking integration means effectively, and decentralisation to make sure you have that robustness in your decision making.
Interesting, considering we have sort of hybrid warfare, which is much more than just the Defence Force. We've got all these other elements as well. I guess there's a question about integration for that as well. We've got questions from Ms Templeman and also from Mr Rebello. So we'll go to Ms Templeman first.
Thank you. Ms Packer, I wanted to ask you about the thinking you have around critical seaborne supply as being paramount to us being able to defend ourselves in any ongoing conflict, and differentiating between the things we can have sovereign capability around versus those that we're always going to have to rely on the ocean being the way we get stuff here. So, I mean, it might be worthwhile just explaining a little bit of that to people. But my question is around, given how important it is to be protecting maritime trade, just what role you see AUKUS having in that capability to protect that trade?
No, thank you for the question. I think this is a really critical question. And so when we think about the defence of Australia, historically there's been this strategic debate about do we defend the continent, i.e. the land, or do we defend something broader than that, which is our maritime domain? When people think about conflict, they often think about invasions, they think about land warfare, and to be fair, with the exception of World War II, predominantly that is our history. But the kind of conflict that we are thinking about in the Indo-Pacific, which is a maritime region, is very much a maritime conflict. Now, Australia is almost unique in many ways in terms of the size of its maritime domain, third largest exclusive economic zone in the world, could list a bunch of statistics, and its dependency on the maritime domain. So we are the 5th largest user of shipping, 98, 99%, throw out a quote like that, depends on the quarter, of our imports and exports go through the maritime domain. So what this means for Australia is that Australia's critical vulnerability exists outside of its land. Now, of course, we have critical vulnerabilities in space and cyber as well. But when it comes to the maritime domain, this is a gross quote, but you should think of Australia as kind of a living organism with its organs outside of its body. It's gross. But what it means is our vulnerability is not invasion or land warfare in Australia. Our vulnerability is our dependency on the maritime domain and the size of our maritime domain. Now, often people say, who would argue for the defence of territory, that you just can't simply defend our maritime trade. We have 30,000 ships a year, you can't defend all of them, which is true. You don't need to defend all of them. What you need to defend is the critical seaborne supply that can keep your war effort going and keep your economy functioning. And the third element, I would say, keep the economies and war efforts of your critical partners and allies functioning. So that is a much smaller subset than the 30,000 ships that visit Australia a year. It's still quite a difficult task. How do you grapple with that task? The first bit is understanding what your dependency is. What is your critical seaborne supply? We learned a lot about our supply chains during COVID. In the public domain, we haven't really touched the conversation since. What are the things that we are so dependent on to, one, keep the war effort going, two, keep our economy functioning? And obviously we're not talking about the Nikes and iPhones that come on ships. We're talking about the fuel, the fertiliser that allows us to grow our food. We're talking about ammunition, etc. Once we understand that, then the next step to really being able to protect our maritime trade is understanding what we should be producing in Australia ourselves and what is just beyond us in terms of capability and in terms of economic feasibility. Once you get past that, then you understand what your critical seaborne supply is, which is what is the things that you would need to protect in the event of a crisis or conflict. Any adversary that looks at Australia would look at that vulnerability straight away and think, I could do a distant blockade on Australia. I could interrupt, for example, Australia's crude oil coming across the Indian Ocean, which is refined predominantly in Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia, and Australia would cease to function. So that is Australia's unique vulnerability, which is why it is important for us to have a robust maritime capability. Maritime not meaning naval, maritime of course meaning both, well in fact all of the domains in terms of how they influence the maritime domain, from space, from cyber, from land to air. This has always been Australia's critical vulnerability, and you can see in the Defence Strategic Review and in the NDS a pivot towards thinking about that vulnerability and protection of the maritime domain, but we are a long way off being able to achieve that. Hopefully that answers your question.
And the role of AUKUS?
Oh, sorry, the role of AUKUS. Well, look, when I think of AUKUS, to be honest, I think of Pillar 1. I know I like to think of AUKUS in some ways like a seeing eye picture. In the Australian debate, people look into the seeing eye picture that is AUKUS and try and see whatever they want to see in it. But really, when you look at where the money is, the most important thing for Australia with respect to AUKUS is Australia's acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines. Now, it's not saying Pillar 2 isn't important. It is important, but this is much more important. Why is it important? Look, when AUKUS was announced, it was called a strategic deterrent. I would disagree with it being a strategic deterrent. It's an operational deterrent. It will stop a task group operating near Australia. But it's not a strategic deterrent, except for the fact that a strong ADF is a strategic deterrent. How does AUKUS assist then as an operational deterrent? A couple of ways. One, how would you impact Australia's seaborne supply? Some people say that you just sit there and lob missiles at it from bases or other ships. That is highly unlikely. It's quite hard to target in the maritime domain at those ranges. You would most likely send a task group to interfere with our seaborne supply. Now, that may not be anywhere near Australia. That might be across the Indian Ocean or across the Pacific. How does AUKUS help with that? One, nuclear-powered submarines are incredibly hard to detect, and my background is as an anti-submarine warfare officer chasing submarines. They have long endurance, so they hold at risk any naval ships that would seek to interfere with our seaborne supply. That's one point. Two, the knowledge that a nuclear-powered submarine would be operating potentially in that vicinity means that task groups, naval task groups, are unlikely to try and operate there. Of course, AUKUS and nuclear-powered submarines have a range of roles, from insertion of special forces to intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, but in terms of protecting our seaborne supply, they restrict the ability of a potential adversary to interfere with our seaborne supply, which I think is critical.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Mr. Rebello.
Thank you, Chair. I had two questions, if that's okay. The first one's sort of a bit more conceptual, but something I'm very interested in is the national sentiment of understanding where we're at in terms of risk. So while we in this room and you may have an appreciation of the risk over the next decade, I'm conscious that public sentiment informs political decision making to a certain extent, and also the ability to act. And so I was just wondering if the Lowy Institute has done any work or research regarding the understanding of the general population, and if there is any shift or not. That's the first question. And the second was just in relation to AUKUS as well. So have we, obviously there's been a lot of talk about AUKUS, and with the changes in the rhetoric coming out of the United States, have we seen any retaliation to AUKUS, and is anything expected as we strengthen our relationships further?
No, thank you, and thank you for the questions. Look, on the first question, Lowy does undertake annual polling, which is quite instructive on a number of these questions. I'm not personally involved in that polling, and I don't have the figures in front of me, so I'll talk in general terms, but can provide the figures after this in terms of more specific terms. With respect to the Australian public's sentiment, certainly Lowy, but also USSC polling indicates that they are increasingly concerned about China. In fact, the last Lowy poll showed 51% of Australians support increasing defence spending. So what I would say is that there is increasing awareness of our strategic situation. Is there increasing understanding of what that necessarily means, though, for the Australian way of life? I would say no, but I would say that anecdotally, based on the questions that I'm frequently asked from the public in all sorts of events. And I would also point to the Australian reaction to Task Group 107, which was the Chinese naval task group, not flotilla or fleets. It was 3 ships that circumnavigated Australia and caused us to effectively lose our mind in the public debate. Why do I say that's important? Because I think that there is increasing awareness of the threat, but there is not increasing awareness of what that means for Australia, which is why there was such shock and genuine surprise at 2 ships and a tanker circumnavigating Australia. And I'm not trying to diminish the demonstration that was to Australia, but in terms of an actual threat to Australia, it was not. But there was genuine concern in the Australian public around that, and I still get asked questions all the time now in terms of, were they rehearsing missile strikes on Sydney Harbour? That's not how ships do missile rehearsals. Over-the-horizon missiles aren't targeted from organic sensors. It makes no sense. Was the Virgin pilot the first to know about this missile firing? 1, there wasn't a missile firing, and 2, the Virgin pilot wasn't the first to know. But genuine concern. So I think there is still a lot of work to do to explain to the public what the changing strategic situation, which I think they acknowledge, and certainly the polling would reflect, means for their way of life and how that might manifest potentially in the future for Australia. And I think that's a really delicate thing to thread, because you want to be alert but not alarmed. And I think a lot of the response to Task Group 107 earlier this year was panic and alarm. I would also group into that the spy ship saga during the first week of the election campaign. There was 48 hours where there was this Chinese spy ship off the south coast of Australia, which most certainly was not a spy ship for a whole bunch of reasons and wasn't possibly doing what it said was doing. But I think that there needs to be more information to the general public about how this might manifest as a potential threat to Australia, what it might mean for our way of life, but also diffusing some of that paranoia when these events occur, which they will occur more frequently. We will see more Chinese naval task groups. We will see probably actual spy ships. We will see more incidents, and explaining to the public what that means and what the threat level will become increasingly important. Now, this isn't the question you asked me, but I'm going to answer it anyway. I do think that we need to think about how we communicate with the public. When we have a bushfire, what we have is a person, generally from the Country Fire Brigade, standing up there in a uniform, respected, explaining the facts. When we have a flood, we have a member of the SES standing there explaining the facts. When we have a defence incident, we have politicians explaining the facts, which means they become instantly political and contested, which is what occurred in those two incidents. So I think that in informing the public in a factual way, I really think that we should allow Defence to speak more to the public, an official Defence spokesperson that breaks down the facts in the same way we do as a fire and a flood. On the second question around AUKUS, look, I think that a broader comment first. Look, I think that we lack confidence as a country generally in a whole range of reasons, a whole range of areas. And so culturally, we often think the worst, sometimes those worst manifest, and there are some defence capability acquisitions where the worst is manifested. But generally it doesn't. So I think that is in many ways the way that at least some of the media commentary has approached AUKUS. So AUKUS is constantly sinking, except for the fact that when you look at the achievements since its announcement in 2021, there is a significant number of achievements. In fact, it has the most degree of focus and probably the most on track of any capability acquisition that I can think of in recent time. But yet we remain concerned and a little bit paranoid. And I'm not trying to diminish the expense of AUKUS, the challenge of AUKUS, and also the risks, the real risk associated with that. Why do I say that? Because when it comes to the US, look, the US submarine industrial base, which is often articulated as one of the key risks to AUKUS, it is a challenge, absolutely. The US is not building enough submarines for their planned force structure, which is 66 nuclear-powered attack submarines by 2054, not 66 by 2025, as it's often quoted. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they would not be in a position to sell submarines to Australia during phase 2 of AUKUS in the 2030s, nor does it mean that if that didn't happen, that we wouldn't build our own submarines. But yet every time this is mentioned, there seems to be a crisis that AUKUS is failing. In terms of the US sentiment, look, again, I think the US submarine industrial base is a problem, but I actually think the US is getting so much out of this deal in terms of access, in terms of basing, in terms of having an ally who, if we can get there into the 2040s, has their own independent nuclear-powered submarine industrial base, that it would be strange, and of course strange things come out of the US, but for any rational thinking president in 2031, which is when the decision needs to be made, not in 2025, to decide that 3 submarines on paper in their order of battle is more important than their access to Australia and the defence relationship. And I could go on, but I personally have not been as concerned about some of the sentiment coming out of the US as our media and some people who would like to push that sentiment have portrayed, because of how good a deal it is for them.
Sure. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Ms. Clutter.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ms. Parker, for being here this evening. I have 2 questions, and they're quite separate, so I might ask one and then answer, then ask the other. The first one is in relation to our Pacific neighbours. So we've just had I'll call it the Crocodile Treaty, signed with Papua New Guinea. Do we need to have a stronger focus on mirroring those types of arrangements with other countries in the Pacific? Have we got the balance right between focusing on that area, our own domestic capability, and our traditional allies? And what do we need to get out of further engagement in the Crocodile Treaty sense with our Pacific partners?
So thank you for the question. I think the Pacific is a clear theatre of contestation. Going back to the question about seaborne supply for Australia, the idea of a military or security lodgement from a country such as China in the Pacific would be catastrophic for our security. And I don't mean to sound dramatic, which that sounds, but it is true. A couple of reasons, but one of the critical ones is it would be the ability to cut Australia and the US off in terms of seaborne supply in the event of a crisis or conflict. So we need to work hard to compete in that area to ensure that there is not any degree of military base established or military lodgement. Now, some people might look at that and think that is highly unlikely. It's not unlikely. There is a lot of evidence to suggest these are discussions that have been going on. I think Australia has actually done quite well in the Pacific, whereas I think that, we don't have certain capabilities, we have some structural problems. I think that our defence engagement has been a real strength, and the Pacific is an example of that. Now, some people will point to the delay in the Puck Treaty with Papua New Guinea as an example of Australia failing. I don't think it's an example of Australia failing. It was signed. It's an example of the extreme competition that exists in the Pacific. Should we do establish similar defence treaties across the Pacific? Papua New Guinea is quite unique. In fact, it's only one of 3 countries in the Pacific that have a defence force. So the arrangement in Papua New Guinea is really only appropriate with a couple of countries. For the rest, we need to think about more broadly what are their security concerns and what is the type of relationship we need to support them, allay their security concerns, but also give us the protection that we need. Why was Papua New Guinea important in my personal view? Papua New Guinea, of course, we have significant cultural ties. We talk about 50 years since independence. That's, of course, 50 years since independence from us. But when you think about the potential to cut off Australia, Papua New Guinea geographically is critical to Australia's defence. We learnt that during World War I, we learned that during World War II. So the ability to forward project and protect Papua New Guinea will be critical to Australia's defence. And so I think the Puck Treaty was honestly, I'm critical of many things the current government's done, but I think it was a masterstroke and I think they should be proud. But in terms of lifting and shifting that across the Pacific, I don't think it would be appropriate. But being focused on the different types of security arrangements we can establish with the different Pacific countries depending on what they see as their main concern, bearing in mind that when you look back to the Boe Treaty established by the Boe Declaration established by the Pacific Island Forums going back a few years ago, they think their biggest security concerns are impacts of climate change and illegal fishing. So it does need to be a different approach to those areas.
Thank you. And my second question, if I may, Chair. I think, Ms Parker, you may have been in the room for some of the evidence from the previous section. I don't want to be unfair by paraphrasing what was said, but there was a suggestion that regulation was an impost on business in defence industry. I think there was reference to modern slavery, to the environment, to cybersecurity frameworks and also to export controls, which the latter surprised me as being described as an impost because obviously we had to beef up our Defence Trade Control Act in September last year to inspire the trust and confidence that we need with our AUKUS partners. Do you see these sorts of regulations as holding industry back in terms of industry participation in our defence industrial base?
Look, thank you for the question. Defence industry is not my area of expertise. I can offer some broad comments. In terms of the need to deal with our export controls with the US and UK to support AUKUS in Pillars 1 and Pillar 2, I think that has been a success. There is some concern that has been mentioned to me by representatives of defence industry, predominantly small to medium enterprises, that creates imposts on their ability to work with countries outside of AUKUS countries. I can't offer a personal view on whether that is an accurate or an inaccurate assessment. It isn't something that I have looked at. There is a broader comment that I often hear from small to medium enterprises that the increased regulation creates a greater impost on their staff to be able to comply. And so sometimes it is said that it deters SMEs across Australia who are not traditionally defence focused, more focused in the mining or agricultural industry, but could be scaled to defence. And in fact, when we think about mobilising defence industry will be key to scaling to defence, that they shy away from defence work because of to a degree, those regulations. Again, I can't comment on whether this is a fair or an unfair assessment. But I've also heard, coupled with that there is concern that there's actually not a lot of money in defence right now. And I know that goes at odds with our historical spending. I'm happy to explain that. And there's also not a lot of certainty because defence projects do often seem to be cancelled.
Yep. Thank you, Chair.
Wonderful. We've got Mr. Batt. Thanks.
Thanks, Chair. And Ms. Ham actually covered the first one I was going to talk about defence relationships in the Indo-Pacific, but moving on from that with terms of reference 6, developing our strategic partnerships with some of the nations that we haven't usually been as traditional partners in the Pacific or right across India, Japan, those sort of places. Your thoughts on how that is working for our national security?
Look, I think this is working really well. If I was to write down a scorecard of Australia's work on its defence strategy and resourcing its defence strategy, I think I would give its highest score to its defence partnerships. There's other areas I would give extremely low scores, but defence partnerships would be high. I mean, when I think about diversifying our defence relationships, if you look at the Australian defence relationship with Japan, I mean, it is almost unrecognisable from 10 years ago. 10 years ago, in a previous life, I was actually trying to plan a bilateral exercise, naval exercise with Japan. There was little interest, there was little focus, it was very hard to do. Now, almost every multilateral exercise that we do has a Japanese element in it, or we participate in a large degree of their multilateral exercises. We've exchanged liaison officers in our joint headquarters. I'm not sure that we could be any closer, except for if Japan was part of the Five Eyes intelligence sharing arrangement. So I think that has been a significant step change in the relationship, reflective across many governments. I would say the same about India. Again, in another life, about 10 years ago, I was trying to establish the first ever bilateral exercise with India. It was very, very difficult, very hard going, and not a lot of interest, in my view, from the Indian government side. Around that time, we were trying to be re-invited into exercise Malabar, which is an exercise that involves the US, Japan, India, and had involved Australia previously. We had removed ourselves from it in the early 2000s. Now, when you look at the Australia-India relationship, that little exercise I was trying to stand up 10 years ago, AUS-Index, now occurs regularly, involves submarines, involves maritime patrol, aircraft. We had India participate this year in Talisman Sabre for the first time, which my understanding, I might be wrong on the facts, is they've been invited a number of times, but this time they participated, which is actually, I guess, goes to the strength of the relationship. So there will always be some challenges in the strategic trust, I suspect, between Australia and India because of India's relationship with Russia and the defence acquisition from Russia, which is changing a little bit. But I think, again, we have significantly improved that relationship over 10 years. And I think there is a lot of objective evidence you can point to with that. More broadly, in terms of our other relationships, I think Australia has always been an effective partner with Southeast Asian nations, and we still see that occurring through the Five Power Defence arrangements and other activities and exercises. And I think that when you look at New Zealand, which many would say has been a historical relationship, but I would say has been largely ignored for the last 10 years, we've seen a strengthening of that relationship, both between army-to-army agreements, navy-to-navy agreements. I'm going to forget the term of it, but in the recent defence ministers' meeting, there was a joint declaration that had basically a similar strategic outlook and about 5 objectives of things to go after. So I could go on, but I think that our defence relationships, broadening of our defence relationship has been a key development in the last 10 years and a key strength. Of course, we shouldn't rest on our laurels. I think some of it will be undermined a little bit, or at least plateaued, because of our limited availability of defence capability. It is hard to work with partners regularly when you have limited ships, for example. But I think that we have done well in that part. And again, I didn't even talk about the Philippines, but the Philippines as well, that is a relationship that you wouldn't recognise 10 years ago. 10 years ago, the relationship was focused predominantly on counter-terrorism, and that was effectively it. Now we are doing extensive amount of activities with the Philippines across all domains and regularly doing multilateral maritime cooperative activities, which again is a buzzword or a made-up word, naval exercises in the West Philippine Sea in response to China's increased aggression. So I think that we have done well in broadening our defence relationships. But when we have a limited defence capability, which is going to be the case, to be honest, over the next decade, particularly in the maritime domain, it will become a harder challenge to do those operations and exercises together.
If I could follow up, Chair, just being the defence relationships is a very high score, as you mentioned. You also mentioned there's some other things that are very low score. Can you give us an indication on what they are, as much as we have time for?
Yeah, look, I think that resourcing our strategy is probably one of our weak areas. Now, again, as I said in my opening remarks, this is not an easy conversation for any government. There are lots of trade-offs. Everybody would like more money, whether it's in healthcare or education, etc., etc. But when we think about resourcing our strategy, I mentioned the example before in terms of our ability to defend against missile strikes on Australian critical infrastructure, which is extremely limited. When we think about our maritime capability, I detailed our dependence on seaborne supply, which in many ways is kind of a unique dependence in terms of the sheer dependence on seaborne supply of our country. We have 10 surface combatants. If you go a 3-to-1 ratio, say you have for every 3 ships, you've got 1 operational, 1 in training, 1 in maintenance. We've got about 3 to 4 probably operational. We have 2 replenishment tankers, which in a 3-to-1 ratio means that you wouldn't have one available every day of the year. If they were working, they haven't been working for the last 18 months. My understanding is they are now working from the last defence estimates. We have 1 mine warfare vessel. A quick way to interfere with Australia's seaborne supply is to lay mines or claim you have laid mines around critical ports or the Torres Strait. Our ability to clear those mines, which is a key task for Australia during World War II, something we did for years after, is severely hampered by the fact that we have 1 mine warfare vessel. Now, there are some other ways to do it, and the replacement project was cancelled in last year's IIP. So I think the resourcing the strategy, there have been some big hallmark decisions, as I said, that deserve kudos. The expansion of the surface combatant fleet, AUKUS, Army's acquisition of HIMARS, which, my understanding is they're operating about 8 now, they'll have 42 by 2027. They're all big ticks. But could we enact our strategy and defend our critical seaborne supply or critical infrastructure against missile attack? The answer to that is no. And so I think that's where I'd give a low score.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for your evidence. I read a couple of your articles. The task of the committee is to investigate the annual report. We've set a number of terms of reference. I'll ask the Secretariat to provide that to you just as a prompt for anything further you think might be able to help us with. But I'd like to just put to you that, you're a former naval officer. We see all the movies where there's rivalry and who's got the best uniform between, the Navy, Army, Air Force. Now we've also got space and cyber in there, 5 domains. You've given us very powerful evidence today about the need for a littoral capacity. What about the other forces? Are they just there in the background now because the strategic response to the reality has shifted? Are people going to say, well, look, she's just biased because she's from the Navy and she doesn't really understand the importance of the other 4 forces? So my question goes to our pivot towards sea power and capability. It seems a big change for defence. You've highlighted critical tension or critical failure points, really, in terms of our operational capacity. What are the key challenges that you think this committee should focus on in the next 3 years?
Yeah, look, thank you. And I understand, the power of service parochialism is always debated. And in fact, it's been one of the largest debates in Australian strategic history. And in fact, it's held back Australian strategic thinking. I'm not advocating for a strong Navy. I'm advocating for Australia to have a maritime strategy which involves strength in all 5 domains, but involves the ability to project power across our maritime domain. And I'm not arguing for a littoral strategy. In fact, a littoral strategy would not protect our seaborne supply. we're talking about a blue water maritime capability. And it's not even just about defence. This, I would say, is loosely in your terms of reference in terms of progress towards a national defence strategy. Our lack of a Coast Guard and the fact that our Navy conducts our constabulary operations is a huge weakness in terms of thinking about Australia from a maritime defence perspective. I know the term Coast Guard becomes political, but whatever you want to call it, our layered maritime defence is impacted by the lack of that. So it's not a shift towards the Navy, it's a shift towards maritime thinking that all of the services and all the domains have a clear role in. But I do get concerned when people say, well, you know, it's tanks versus ships. That's not the conversation. The conversation is what are Australia's vital interests? Our vital interests are unique because of our geography. How do we protect those vital interests? Developing a force that protects Australia's territory does not protect our vital interests. To my point earlier that you can stop Australia's ability, so coerce Australia through the maritime domain, and I would add space and cyber domain, without stepping foot on Australia or lobbing a missile on Australia. So that's why we need to focus on a maritime capability. Maritime capability includes Army Maritime Strike, includes littoral manoeuvre. But our region is a maritime region. So I think that that is critically important. In terms of the areas where I think our largest investment gaps are, you may have picked it up, but I think integrated air and missile defence is critical for Australia. There is limited money in it. Now, it's hard to say in the public domain how much. Of course, a number of the capabilities that would contribute to integrated air and missile defence, the ability to detect missiles and defeat missiles, would of course exist in the classified domain. But I am comfortable to say that our ability to do that is limited. Now, of course, Australia is a big continent. We are never going to have a golden dome or anything like that. That's not how you effectively think about Australia's defence. But we do need to be able to protect critical infrastructure, and not just in the north. This obsession with the north is important for Australia's defence, yes, but we are vulnerable in other areas. That naval task group that circumnavigated Australia, one of those ships, the Wren High frigate with 112 vertical launch systems, that can carry a missile that can go 9,000 kilometres. So HMAS Sterling and our bases to the south are also vulnerable. So number one, integrated air and missile defence needs to be sorted, and that needs more money. Number two, to enable any of those operations I've talked about, you need space capability, you need resilient space capability, you need sovereign space capability. The idea that we could rely on the US or civilian providers for our space capability to support our command and control backbone and our targeting, in my view, is ludicrous. Two reasons. One, the US will always prioritise their operations. Of course they would, as should we. There have been times in our history, many times, where we have lost space capability because they have prioritised it to other things. Relying on civilian space capability, well, there's a key lesson from Ukraine when they relied on Starlink, which they have used for a lot of their operations effectively. But during one of their uncrewed surface vessel operations in the Black Sea, where they were trying to attack a base in Crimea, Starlink was turned off and the USVs went unserviceable and were lost. We must invest in that capability. The third thing I would say, before I get to ships, which we need more ships and in a quicker time frame, is actually our strategic personnel reserves. The Defence Strategic Review said we needed to look at our reserve capability. You're never going to have a standing force in the ADF, even if you can grow it by 2040, by 20,000 or whatever the numbers are now, that can do the tasks that you need it to do. You need to have a reserve capability that can do some of that. But that requires planning. Right now, in my personal view, and I have some experience having worked on the defence workforce growth and having been Chief of Staff of Career Management in Navy, the reserve SIRCAT system, service category system, is generally, with some exceptions in Army, established to backfill desk positions in the services. Now, Army is the exception, of course. We need to think about how did we do this previously? What are the capabilities our reserve force provides? Is that, this may be a good idea, might be a bad idea. Is it patrol boat capability? Is it our Coast Guard capability? Is it our mine warfare capability? It may be, it may not be. But the idea that it is just people to backfill desks as opposed to critical strategic capabilities is the wrong way of thinking about it. And I guess with no disrespect to the women and men who worked hard on the Defence Reserve Review that was released before Christmas last year, I think it missed the boat on that. Reserves clearly have a role in home defence. What is that? They might have a role in integrated air and missile defence. There's a misnomer that modern warfare is so incredibly technical that unless somebody's living and breathing those capabilities every day, they can't value add. I think that's entirely incorrect. You just need to look at
What's happening in the Ukraine.
what's happening in Ukraine, what's happened in Israel and Gaza, Iran, to know that that's untrue. So the third priority I would say is understand the strategic role of the reserve capabilities and resource and fund that. That would be my top three. Then I'd start talking about ships.
Okay. I'm glad you got to the ships last. That just puts to bed that you're a Navy first all the time. Thank you for your evidence, and I think the committee has benefited greatly from hearing it. As I said, there is so much information. We've got a lot of people here. There's new people on our committee, and we're determined to make sure that we communicate in a way that Australian people understand. We understand, the changing nature of the geostrategic reality that we confront. And I think everyone here wants to make sure that our Defence Force is as strong as it possibly can be to do what it needs to do. So we're all ears for any further insights that you want to give us, particularly in those terms of reference. And we'll be going around again next year, and I expect that we'll want to call on your insights again, Ms Parker. Thank you very much for joining us today. You have been asked to provide some material on notice. If you could respond to the committee, the Secretariat, through the Secretariat by the 14th of November, that would be very welcomed. You will also receive a copy of the transcript of your evidence, and you'll have an opportunity to request corrections to any transcription areas. I'd like to thank committee members and witnesses for their time this evening. Thank you to the Secretariat. Thank you to Broadcast and Hansard for helping us talk to our fellow citizens about these important matters. And I declare the hearing closed. Thank you.